Welcome to the Writers League of Texas podcast, conversations and presentations featuring writers and industry professionals talking about the craft and business of writing. More information about this discussion, including details on our panelists and presenters, can be found at writersleague.org. We hope you enjoy the discussion.
Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Our panel tonight is how to turn a mess of pages into a book. And the idea behind this panel is I found in my own work and like just writers that I've been reading is that like you have this initial burst of energy when you're working on a book, and it's great, and all your ideas are awesome, and you get them all down, and then at a certain point, like it becomes work. And like when that work begins, like what do you do? Like what are the things that get you to the end of the manuscript, either the end of the first draft or getting you to like a draft that begins to resemble a book? And so we're going to talk about that tonight. We've got 4 great panelists, so let me introduce them to you. Dalia Azim's stories and essays have appeared in American Short Fiction, Glimmer Train, Aperture, Other Voices, Pendle Boys, and Columbia Journal, among other places. She has been a recipient of Glimmer Train's Short Story Award for New Writers and is perpetually at work and nearing completion on her first novel. She lives in Austin, Texas with her family and is the manager of special projects at the Blanton Museum of Art. Please welcome Dalia. James Crowley is a writer and filmmaker. He grew up in Austin and has been actively involved in the film industry for over 20 years. He's a graduate of the writing program at St. Edward's University. He started his film career in the locations department and went on to location manage and scout movies such as Disney's Hidalgo, the Chronicles of Narnia series, and Transformers: Age of Extinction. Disney Hyperion Books published his first novel, Starfish, in 2010. It won the Reading the West Book Award and was featured at the Book Festival here in Austin. The Penguin's Young Readers Group published Crowley's second novel, Monsterland, in 2017, and recently acquired his third novel, The Middle School 3000. Crowley's feature film debut as writer-director, The Journeyman, won the Audience Award at the 2001 South by Southwest Film Festival. Please welcome James. Alison Macor is the author of Rewrite Man, the life and career of screenwriter Warren Scarron, and the award-winning Chainsaws, Slackers, and Spy Kids, 30 Years of Filmmaking in Austin, Texas. She's also a freelance writer and former film critic for the Austin Chronicle and the Austin American Statesman. She holds a PhD in radio TV film from the University of Texas at Austin and has taught film courses at the University of Texas, Austin Community College, and the Austin Museum of Art. Please welcome Alison. And Cory Putman Oakes is the author of The Veil, Dinosaur Boy Saves Mars, and Witchtown. Sometime around 6th grade, she had to face the sad truth that being a heroine in a Madeleine L'Engle book was not a valid career choice. Since then, she graduated from UCLA and the Cornell Law School, worked as an associate at a big law firm, and taught at Texas State University, deciding that writing books was the best alternative to living in them. Please welcome Cory. So I thought we'd begin with an easy question, which is just to tell us about either the book that you're currently working on or the book that you've finished and is out in the world. Like just like sort of what is the basic premise of it, and like what is one challenge that you had in the middle, and maybe you're like currently trying to like solve this challenge, or you did sort of like figure it out, at least for the time being. And Cory, I'll start at your end of the table since you were the last to be introduced. Tell us about your most recent book and like one challenge.
Okay, so I'm at the very, very beginning stages of a middle grade book right now. It's about a haunted hotel, and it's kind of You Got Mail meets The Haunted Mansion. It's about a girl whose family owns the haunted hotel, like the family-owned haunted hotel, and a big chain hotel, haunted hotel, moves in down the street. And I just started. But it's been really fun, but I guess my challenge so far has been that I'm writing a dual point of view. I'm writing the girl whose family owns the hotel and a girl who's a ghost who works at the chain hotel. So I guess my challenge, even though one is dead and one is not, they're both girls, so I'm trying to figure out how to kind of make their voices very distinct, and at the same time make you really like both of them. So that's my challenge right now.
Just to stick with that for just a moment, how do you approach that challenge? How do you, are there particular exercises that you do, or things that you try out to make the voices distinct?
Yeah, I'm one of those writers who does a lot of writing that never really appears in the book. I have tons and tons of Word documents that are like kind of just for me. So I've tried to do a lot with both of them, like kind of developing their backstory and figuring out kind of, you know, what they would do in a typical day and just things to try to make their voice, you know, sound more realistic to me. And probably none of that stuff will actually get in the book, but it's really helpful to me.
I always think that those pages are going to make it in, which, like, for better or for worse, I think it does help kind of excavate the characters, but yeah, that's my answer on that.
I definitely keep all mine in a file for later, like, oh, maybe I could recycle it somewhere, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a big outliner, and so like I follow the outline, and I work. I think I'm the only nonfiction person here, so I work with a lot of, you know, archival materials and transcriptions, and just so I try to organize that stuff before I go into each chapter. But I think one of the challenges for me right now, and this isn't really getting to your other question, but is trying to be more free with that and to back off a little bit from the outline and be more open to maybe this should change a little bit and not be afraid of that as much.
Yeah, maybe you could talk about that a little more, because when we think of outlines, we tend to think of like trying to give ourselves a sense of direction. And for novels, right, anything can happen, so it can be useful because it can sort of point you in the right direction. With nonfiction, like, you're not inventing the things that happen. Like, you have sort of the material in front of you, and so like, what does that mean in terms of like being free and, you know, giving yourself permission to sort of move beyond or outside the outline?
Well, to say that, all right, I write books about film, people in the film industry, or, you know, histories, and so to say, well, I think I'm going to follow sort of the production schedule of how this film came to be, and that could be out of sequence, because a lot of films shoot out of sequence, you know, and try to hit the highlights. But what if I take a detour instead, and I use that as a way into a break narrative section and talk about, you know, something that's relevant to give context. You know what I mean? To try to like to just trust that a little bit more. I think with my first book, I was not as willing, because I was dealing with archival materials and transcripts from over 200 interviews, so I really felt like I have to stick to this outline or I'm going to die. You know, I have to get through it. But for this most recent book I did, which was a biography, just there are points where I just tried to back off a little bit, and maybe I remember when I was interviewing Bill Whitliff for my first book, he's like, we call that walking around time, you know, when you kind of leave the project and you just sort of do other things to think about it. And so I try to do that more and let things bubble up a little bit more. And I guess what you were talking about, like writing, you know, doing character sketches and things like that, and maybe putting it to the side, but knowing it's there and pulling from it and allowing that to kind of inform maybe the shape a little bit more.
James, how about you?
Well, I think before I'd always been very much like I knew exactly what the story was going to be almost from A to Z, and it pretty set in my head, and I've always been fortunate to where I've been able to see them in my head very clearly. I dream in movies almost. They're kind of boring movies, but my dreams are always like I went to the store, but they're very, you know, you can see it. And my first book was very much like that. I knew it. The book I'm working on right now, I kind of knew what it was. Monster Island was a little different, and it went on, it went on for a while, and so it kind of took on a life of its own. I knew kind of A to Z, but the middle definitely started to change, and mostly that was with introduction of new characters that would take it in a different direction.
You know, you mentioned in the middle of the book, you didn't quite know where it was going, and it's a book where a character sort of enters a new world and then is introduced to a series of new characters. how did you just sort of like have those characters lined up and you knew that like we're going to encounter them? How did you navigate through that section that you didn't know what was going to happen?
Well, I think like the kid, Charlie, I think what it was I hadn't done a lot of world building. My first book was based on historical fiction for kids. So I had something to base on. This, suddenly you start writing it and you're like, oh, well, I can't just say they have their own government, the monsters. Now I need to explain how they have them, are the people elected? And then it just started to take a life on of its own, to where the more things I would introduce, they would lend themselves to explanation. Another character would come in, and the same thing. I will say Monsterland for me, maybe it's because it was a little bit kind of like a kid thing from when you're 10 years old, Halloween story, but it definitely just flowed differently than my first book, Starfish, which it took a lot of historical research, and I don't know. I guess I'm not saying I didn't think about this, but it definitely felt more like I went on a journey with the kid, for sure. That makes sense.
It does. Yeah. Dalia, tell us about the book that you're working on.
Well, in hindsight, I realized I took on a novel that's sort of ambitious beyond my skill set for our first novel, but it's a multi-generational, multi-perspective book that spans like from the 50s until pretty much the present, and goes between Egypt and the U.S. And I feel like my biggest challenge, I've had an agent for a few years who's helped me revise, who's given me notes. She hasn't done the writing with me, but she's given me a lot of notes for a few years. And I feel like my big challenge is actually just like distilling one story from these multiple stories. And last time we were kind of hitting a new revision, she was telling me, like, I feel like, because I had these other solutions that just keep branching out from the primary story, and she was like, we just need to bring it all together. And that's been my big challenge with this book.
And is that what you mean by it's beyond your skill level? Because like,
Yeah.
we all experience that as writers, right? Like you bump up against the things like, I just don't quite know how to do that, or I can see it, but I can't make it happen on the page. Like when you bump up against those things, like what do you do? Do you try to like improve in those areas, or do you just sort of like veer around them and find other ways?
Well, I've ended up restructuring a lot. I felt comfortable with short stories, and I wrote the first few drafts as sort of like independent short stories, and that's like my pitch was like an hour long, like first this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and that doesn't work. So now I'm really kind of taking, because they are all connected. They're in my brain, they're all connected. But when she asks me again and again, what's this book about, and she wants one sentence, I have been sort of hard-pressed to answer that. And so I feel like with this latest revision, I'm just bringing it all into one story. Still keeping the multiple points of view, but trying to make it more resonant, like across the different stories.
I was going to say, too, I had one chapter in Rewrite Man that just, I don't know if it wasn't my favorite film of the bunch that Scarin had screenwritten. He was a well-known script doctor at the time. He lived here in Austin, and he did Top Gun, Beetlejuice, Beverly Hills Cop 2, and Batman, and a host of others. And I won't say which chapter that was, but I was just really struggling with it. And I was like, oh man, this feels like I'm walking into my old job at the hardware store where I worked in high school, like put my card in, sitting at my desk, oh God, And I think sometimes you just have to sort of show up, put your time card in and do it, and just, think, oh, this is awful, and what I wrote was awful. But gradually, you have awful stuff on the page, and then you can kind of go back to it and just try to sculpt it and, share it and maybe get help that way. I don't know. I remember those months. There was about a month on that chapter, and it just felt kind of miserable, but then it didn't, so.
How do you know when it feels like that, when it feels like you're just like clocking in and doing the work and it doesn't feel like it's working? How do you know when that's like necessary work and you're gonna come out on the other side to something good? And how do you know when it's like, well, it's because this is not working in like a pretty significant way, and like I should like really rethink it? That to anybody.
I mean, for me, it was just, I didn't know. I mean, I just hoped, by the time I got done, and then I, shared it with someone and got some feedback, and it was, you know, not the piece of that I thought it was, and you know, according to this person, and it wasn't like, okay, good, I can leave that behind. It was just, I think it gave me that confidence, like, just to keep going, and, you know, I'll come back and deal with that later. Because I do think that's another thing, is you've got to move on from some of these things, you know, when you at least have something workable and you can move on to the next thing. I generally write in sequence, and I'm sure most of you know this, all of you know this, that with nonfiction, you know, I don't have an agent. I'm actually going out for an agent now, and so that's like a whole another special hell. But the nonfiction proposal, you're forced to do like a major outline for your project before you've done, you know, going to archives and things like that generally. So you have to really just sort of think big picture, and what do I imagine this book might be, and what will be in each of those chapters. And so you kind of are writing a map for yourself, and it may change, and you know, I'm sure if and when I get an agent, hopefully they'll weigh in and say, no, you want to do this or whatever. But so that, you know, it's sort of in part of that deal is to have an outline that helps you.
Just to add something, I think my first book was kind of set up like an older fashioned book where it had the chapter, you know, chapter 9, where James talks at the microphone, you know, where they put the little slugs. And that was a placeholder for me from just what you said, as I was doing it because I couldn't figure out, oh, what's happening here, or this chapter's just horrible, this paragraph. So I very quickly figured out, you got to just move on, and it'll figure itself out down the road. And sometimes it'll figure it out because it has to. I mean, you know, like, oh, I have to turn it in now. So the horrible paragraph needs to just get really simple. Tear it down.
I'm curious, maybe it's just like looking for advice for myself, but I've been like, the way I've been, because my friends are like, how are you still working on the same book? But like I feel like with this revision, rather than like avert my gaze, which there's so many places I want to just like go past it and move on and come back to it later, like I'm trying to just live in it, either cut it. Like, do you guys cut it ultimately? Like, do you think that those gut feelings are like, it needs to be reworked? Or, sorry to ask a question, but I'm looking for some
I have a rule
guidance.
on that. Friday afternoon, anything that's like that, I cut it. And if I'm not still thinking about it on Monday, it's just gone.
That's good.
Give yourself the weekend, and if it's not still, it's like kind of like the 20-minute sweater, you know, does anyone know that? Like, you see a sweater, you're like, God, I want that. You're like, no, I'm going to give it 20 minutes. If you're not still thinking about it, you don't really need that, you know, it's the same thing.
But mine's not like that. I don't have mine's just, I'll work on it. If it's not working, suddenly you look, wait, do I even need this sentence? Like, they're already in the room, or, you know, whoop, just take it out.
Take it out, And if you're not pining over it, it's gone.
Yeah.
You know, we've mentioned outlining a little bit, a few times. Just to come back to it once more, how extensively do you all outline before you really begin writing the novel in earnest? And so, like you talked about a nonfiction proposal, which is a pretty extensive outline. You know, chapter sort of headings or slugs, that's an outline. Do you all, like, did you outline for your novel? Cory, did you outline for Witchtown?
I can't outline. It makes me crazy. And it's weird because in my normal life, I'm kind of a type A, like, list. I love charts, you know, like, I'm totally that kind of person, but I can't write like that. I do tend to know, I think James was talking about this, like, I know where my characters are going, you know, so I know what they're like at the beginning and I know what they're going to be like at the end, but I don't necessarily know how they're going to get there. And if I try to outline, it turns out very, very badly, so I can't.
Dalia, how about you? Multi-generational.
Yeah, so I thought I was done. I got an agent, and she made me outline, which I was like, what? I thought we were done. But she's made me outline several times, and it's been really useful, but writing towards an outline, I don't know. I mean, I might just have like a hopelessly inefficient process, but I feel like so much of the work for me comes from like sitting down and like excavating, for lack of a better term, but I have created outlines. They're good roadmaps, but I have to kind of, it doesn't hold fast throughout the whole process. And I was forced to do it.
So you outline when you have no choice.
Yes, under duress.
After you've outlined, then you've got the job of excavating and writing the book itself. And even if you write a book quickly, it still takes a fair amount of time. It's a lot of pages. when you come back to a book, you know, in the morning or whenever you write, how much time do you spend reading like the previous day's work or the previous amount of work? Are you able to jump right in and start writing, or do you have to sort of like get the book in your head and get the voice in your head, the characters, their situations?
I definitely read, you know, a couple pages of what I did the day before. Usually something that was bugging me, like, did that work, or, you know, and then get back in the mood or whatever.
Is there a risk that you start tinkering with those pages and then never move on, or is?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
How do you keep from getting lost in? Because that's the cliche, right? Like people will just like rewrite the first chapter over and over and over again, and never move on. Like what's the trick to like reading those pages, but also not getting stuck in them?
For me, it was being excited about what's happening next, kind of like, oh, I need to rewrite how they got on their horses, but they're about to be in this big fight, or I don't know, action sequence. That'll be fun, you know. So just entertain myself. I think you lie to yourself a lot.
Yeah.
Sitting there. I was telling my significant other the other day, I was like, well, I've been lying to myself for like 7 years about how great this book is. So now I can be like, oh, reality time, you know.
I have a rule for. Oh, sorry.
No,
do you
go
want
ahead.
Yeah, I have a rule for that too. So I'm very rule abiding. I had no idea. It's weird, but so I will rewrite the first chapter kind of over and over again, you know, and I'll let myself do that, but only the first chapter. After that, it's just supposed to suck, and it's fine until I have finished the whole thing. So and for some reason, I like having a really good first chapter. Like it makes me very excited, and it makes me kind of think, okay, the whole book could one day look like this. It just doesn't right now. So I think that kind of curbs my impulses a little bit, but I don't know.
What are some of the things that you're learning and figuring out when you're working on that first chapter? So it's like you're trying to get the characters right and so on, but is there a certain thing like when it's right and you can move on? Is it the voice? Is it the way that you like get the plot moving? What about it?
I think it's largely a voice thing. You know, you kind of get it when you hear your character's voice really clearly for the first time, you kind of know, right? Like it kind of, they say a certain line and you're like, oh yeah, there you are. Like that's you, that's awesome. And you can kind of bring that thread through the whole thing. So I think until I get there, I have a hard time moving on in a significant way. But I don't know.
I was just going to say, like, for me, it's, you know, having a day job, really, having time constraints. And I'm a freelance writer, and I'm a ghostwriter, and up until a few years ago, I was also a teacher, so I would really only have like an hour and a half, maybe, tops, to work on my writing. And so I would just have to, what do I want to do today? Okay, I want to do, these sections, so I need to get in there and do it. And, sometimes it's really hard to leave it and to go to, like, the guide to Arlington, Texas for that Chamber of Commerce. That's like a hard thing to go to after that, but you gotta, so for me, and that was something really that I learned because I started my freelance career the same exact month that I started my PhD. So it was actually really good training for how to time manage.
Would you said like you would have these things that you knew you wanted to do that day, this scene and this scene, this scene. Would you actually would you have a sort of to-do list?
Yeah, I'm a big to-do list person, if you haven't figured that out yet. From outlines, to-do list. Like I want to get through the first meeting for Top Gun, and I want to get through, Tom Cruise balked at this, and I want to get through this, and, try to just hit those things. And sometimes you're in the middle of it, and you think, but I don't remember, he had a quote. There was a quote somewhere in that archival material that's the better quote. And then you just go, don't stop. Just like put something in, slug something in, like better quote here, and then keep going. I mean, I write stuff like that to myself all the time, like to come back the next day. Like, need better segue. That's like my big one in big caps, for the next day. And to come back and start with that.
Do you think writers were more efficient before the internet, when we could just like look stuff up on the job?
I don't know. Well, that's such a rabbit hole, right? Because then you're like, what? This, Harvey Weinstein. Oh my God.
That's true. I'm amazed though if something pops in my head nowadays. Well, I used to do it with a dictionary, encyclopedia, or you get your 6 reference books. So I guess it hasn't changed that much. But I am amazed now how quickly I can be like,
Just find information.
oh, what's
Yeah.
like that tree? Oh, I need to name the tree. And then I'll look it up and I'll start reading like,
2 hours
oh,
later.
Yeah.
what a coincidence. This tree in ancient Rome symbolized exactly what I'm talking about. I'm going to look like a genius, you know? I mean, I was amazed how often there'd be stuff like that would happen. But
So I guess it's a double-edged
internet,
sword,
yeah.
you know, because sometimes it feels like that was easy. I didn't know it, now I know it, and it's in here, and I'm done. But yeah, and then 2 hours later.
But then there's Twitter, right? So then it's
Yeah.
like an hour later, you're like, I've done nothing. I have stared at Twitter for an hour. This is
well,
bad.
in researching monsters too is I don't know. I love Halloween because I never like stopped and was like, I'm going to get an encyclopedia on monsters. And you start reading it and then this isn't a concrete science. So there's a million stories and rabbit holes and Romania. And I was just going, oh my gosh. But there'd always be something you'd find that was amazing. But yeah, you could definitely get lost.
I had the same thing with witches. Very similar.
Oh, I'm
yeah.
sure. Yeah.
Dalia, for your novel, because it's multi-generation and it takes a number of characters, a number of like years, I would imagine that like capturing a voice and getting back into a voice after maybe taking time off from it can be a challenge. How do you get back into it when you've got all these other voices and times sort of like in your head?
I can't say that I've figured that out, but I've tried different things. I've tried writing the parts in a certain perspective, like even though they're like they don't match up in the novel. Although other things are between them, I'll try to write them in sequence just to kind of stay in that style. But it's pretty much going back and reading and trying not to get into the pitfall of rewriting everything, which is probably why it's taken me like over a decade to write this book. But I don't know if I have a good answer, except that I just try to get back into, I have to slip back into it. And it's easier now that I'm kind of expanding the sections. Like they were these kind of 10 to 20 page sections. Now it's almost more novella length for each character, and that feels like I can actually kind of have a whole arc. Hopefully this is the one. But I feel like that's working better for kind of having some continuity in those storylines.
Well, that actually leads up to something I wanted to ask all of you, which is about scope. At a certain point, you have to figure out, is the novel 300 pages? Is the book 400 pages? How many chapters are in it? Each section, how long will it be? Do you know sort of when you begin how big the thing is that you're going to write? Because there's a big difference between, like, say, a 250-page book and a 450-page book. Or do you figure that out later on after you've done some writing?
I think it kind of just happened for me. I didn't stop and think about it, but also there was some stuff from the publisher merged, and there were some things that happened that were not in my editors or my control. So there was just this time all of a sudden where it just stopped, And I worked on Transformers, so it just stopped. So there were these moments like that, but in the meantime, I just kept coming up with stuff. So it kept getting longer and longer. And I'd go back and pick it up after a couple months and be like, oh, I didn't even remember I'd written this chapter. Oh, or wow, this chapter's farther along. So, along the journey, I guess. But I think that book was different for me than other stuff I've written. That one was just kind of, due to that, became its own thing. I plan more on other projects, I guess.
How about for you?
I think for me, I write middle grade books and young adult books, and there's not like set limits for how many words you can have, but there's kind of guidelines. So I kind of go off of that. And probably really one of the only things I know about the book at the beginning is if it's middle grade or YA. So I kind of know what word count I'm aiming for, but that's kind of it, I guess. I guess the rest figures itself out. I don't know.
Yeah.
I remember when I was talking to UT Press about Rewrite Band, and I'd sent them they did my first book, and they said, so what's next? And I said, well, I want to do this book about, one of the people who was in Chainsaws, Warren Scarron, who was first film commissioner, and da-da-da. And, I said he died at a young age, and my editor was like, so short book, probably. I'm like, he was prolific, so, It's funny.
You mentioned, in working on that book, you mentioned all the archives that you went through. You know, and you mentioned like you would put a note that would say, you know, go find that quote later. How do you manage the research? How do you manage just not getting either buried under it or feeling like you can't actually sort of like get through it all and you have to like, you know, shape a narrative and you have to leave stuff out? How do you figure that out?
Well, I had 2 fellowships for Rewrite Man. The archive for Scarin is at the HRC. I had my first fellowship before my first book even came out, so that was like in 2009. And that meant I went for like 4 weeks, and they pay you. So it's like your job is to go there and show up and be in the reading room, which is really luxurious and almost like a prison at the same time. And you go and you write, and I had folders that I just stuffed, you know, those yellow archival papers into, and a lot of people take notes on their laptop, but it just still is easier for me to take notes on that paper for some weird reason, and I would just stuff it in file folders, but then as I got going, I realized I need to be specific and break them down according to film. So Top Gun gets its own folder, Beetlejuice has its own folder. But then he was one of the first people who had came to the archive with a computer. You know, he had done his work on the computer, so they didn't really know how to excavate all that stuff. So there's a lot of duplicate stuff in there that's in different folders that aren't even named things remotely similar. So much later, when I was getting to the end of the archive boxes, I found duplicates of things. It was just a little insane. It was really insane, and I was like, I think it's a duplicate, but it might not be, so I'd have to go back. And then my second fellowship was 4 years later, so it was kind of going back to those early folders and just saying, okay, those have to stay there. I'm starting new folders, and yeah. And then I flew on a plane and had my luggage stolen in Newark, and I had my notes in there for, yeah, I know. Well, hey, it was my first time traveling without a baby, and I was like, I'm gonna just go on that plane with nothing. So I put everything in my checked luggage. Don't ever do that.
Understandable.
So yeah, I had to go back to the archive for a few weeks to like make up that work.
Now James said earlier that, you know, as you get further along as a writer, yeah, you don't feel so bad when you lose something. How did that feel?
I meant sentences.
You know, it was bad, but then you just gotta do it. You know,
Right.
You just gotta redo it. Yeah.
So you mentioned folders, like you kept things in folders. I wonder how the rest of you, how do you organize and manage all the drafts and pages and chapters and parts? There's Scrivener. Do any of you use Scrivener? Dalia, you're nodding. Like how do you use it? Is it effective? Is it how much time did it take you to figure out how to use?
I think it's a really great program. I'm in Word. I'm back in Word. I've been in Word for a few years, but I feel like it was really great both for archiving sources, like internet sources, the rabbit hole sources, or before you get into the rabbit hole, I guess. But then also just because you can move stuff around like blocks. And I found that really useful. And there's that program, Scrivener, looks at things in different layers, so you can sort of get macro or micro as it's helpful. So I found it really useful with a novel that I was trying to structure.
James and Cory, how do you organize like the pages as you're working on them?
I think the word organized is very loose in my case. I can't do Scrivener. It makes me kind of sweaty and nauseous to think about Scrivener. I don't know why, but I have a ton of Word documents for any given thing that I'm working on. Every time I start something new, like a new chapter, I open a new Word document because it just doesn't feel like it goes with the other thing yet. I always end up at some point, I write out of order, so at some point I have to put everything together, so I tend to put little scenes on note cards, like little things, and I end up on the floor moving them all around. My wonderful husband got me a whiteboard with magnets, which I'm trying to work on, because it's better that Kat doesn't come in and move them all around, and I'm like, that was chapter 10, oh my God. So, but yeah, I'm kind of, I'm a little more old school, I guess. I can't see it digitally. Like, I have to see it just, like, in front of me, like, in, hard copy, like, on the floor. For some reason, that's when it's like, yeah, okay, that's a book. I don't know why.
I really don't. I mean, I was saying there's some middle stuff there, but I did know the ending. I it's really weird. I think for me, my day job, this was always a fun thing. So I just kind of did it. And it would start as Monsterland, like, kid gets his candy stolen. So that's a note. And I'd have it on a sticky somewhere. And then it would slowly be like, gets hit in the head. It runs away with his dog. And suddenly I've got so many notes that I'm like, oh, maybe this is a story here. And then, you know,
where do all those notes live?
They live everywhere. No, a lot of times I'll just have an envelope,
Okay.
you know, and it starts getting filled with them. And it's pretty crazy. And then every couple months I'll go through them all, and I just have these folders on my laptop that are like story ideas, great lines, you know, or names, all that. And I'll just kind of keep it there and go mine it later or don't mine it later kind of thing. So, yeah, but it's pretty loose.
So
And
you
I
actually
haven't
transcribe the
done something like
notes
that.
into like a digital form then?
I do, yeah. And then as far as if it's pertaining, let's say Monsterland, it would just be bullet things in chronological order. So, you know, it could be something really dramatic like Franklin wonders if he has a soul, or it could be like Franklin rides a big black Clydesdale. You know, it would be just as much stuff. And then as the character Franklin got bigger, I might have a whole folder or a whole document just on him, everything on Franklin. But it's kind of organized.
Yeah.
No one else could make sense of it, I don't think, though, which is good.
Do you all do something similar? I mean, you think about like in the middle of the book, that's when you're likely to get stuck, right? Because like you're in the mechanics of plot, moving it from like one thing to the next. When you get stuck, do you sort of do those sorts of like, he gets on a black Clydesdale, like, do you just sort of like come up with ideas and see where that takes you? Or do you have to sort of go back into earlier pages to figure out like what is there that you've missed? Like what's your approach for when you're stalled out?
Well, for me, since I write out of order, I don't always know I'm in the middle. And it's like, oh, I'm in the middle. That's great. But when I get stuck, that's when I tend to go back and look at things like the hero's journey or like Save the Cat. Does anyone use Save the Cat, like the screenwriting thing? I can't look at those beforehand or I get sweaty and nauseous. It's the Scrivener thing again. But when I'm stuck, it's really helpful because if whatever the problem is, like if the pacing is off, I can kind of figure out, okay, I veered out of the hero's journey or I veered, you know, out of my beat or something. And I find them really helpful for that. But, you know, some people are the opposite. If they don't have that at the beginning, they just don't know where they're going and they don't feel comfortable. So I think it's just kind of whatever floats your boat for any particular project, right?
I feel lately like when I get stuck, it's an indication that something's not working and that I need to either eliminate or kind of go back. I mean, it's not to say that like it's always flowing if things are right, but it's usually some sort of like litmus test that I'm just like writing myself into a corner or it's not meshing. And I don't know, I'll spend like a day or two in a scene and then I'll usually discover it's just not right. I need to rewind.
I've tried to simplify at that point too. Like, okay, I'm going to make it better, but I was way trying to be Cormac McCarthy here or something. What am I doing? This is a 3-paragraph sentence, you know? And so just go back and be like, they rode across the desert, and then go back and slowly add a little here. And and the newest thing I'm working on, I've been trying to be really sparse, just as a training thing, but let you know how it goes.
I do that too sometimes, like put awesome description here, you know, like just to kind of move on, you know, and that's.
Well, I like to read, sometimes, I mean, I'll go read something else, like another nonfiction book. I know when I was struggling with how to, in Rewrite Man, you know, I open with Scarron's memorial service, and I knew I was going to end with how he died because it was dramatic and it was a juxtaposition with where he was in his career. But I thought, well, I can't just end with him dead. I mean, you can, but you know, I think I need to lift them up a little bit or just, you know, have a little bit of coda. And I just didn't know what to do. And I had heard about this book. I think I think the poet, it's an English poet named, I think, Edward Thomas. If anybody knows poetry, correct me. He was little known, and that's why I got the book. I heard the book was really great, and you know, I'm writing about someone who's not well known, so maybe this would help me. And I remember sort of flipping through to how he wrote about Thomas's death, and then reading some other things, and it was completely different, but it gave me an idea. You know, it was like, oh, I could actually talk about this, and I have a quote somewhere that I can use, you know, and then that was going back to, you know, whatever the post-death file folder or whatever I called it, you know, and so I like going into other people's books sometimes. And I remember for Chainsaws, I needed to know, like, well, I've written about all these movies that are successful, but this one's a failure. So how do I write about that without, like, demonizing it? And, like, I read another book that wrote about, you know, a movie from the 60s that was a really notorious failure, and that just helped me think about ways in.
Is that something that the rest of you do? Do you try to find, I mean, obviously witches is a kind of a genre into itself, monsters, multi-generational novel, that's a genre too. Do you purposefully go and look at other books in that genre to kind of get ideas, or do you sometimes feel like you have to stay away from them because you can also sort of lose your own voice or identity?
Both for sure. I mean, on this one, there were a lot of references to Bram Stoker's Dracula and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, so I didn't mind looking at those. I didn't, you know. But something more contemporary, I would feel like, I don't want to read this until I'm done, kind of.
Yeah, for me, it's more an age group thing. When I'm writing middle grade, I like to try to read middle grade. If I start reading YA, the writing I do the next day tends to be a little bit more long-winded and more suited to YA, so I try to stay with whatever age group I'm doing. But it can be hard when new stuff comes out. I'm like, oh, I can't read that yet. It stinks, but...
Dalia, have there been books that you have, like, gone to look for ideas for structure or...
For structure, I feel like any good book is a teacher. Like, I definitely gravitate towards books that are in a similar vein to mine. But I just think that and that's another thing, when I'm stuck, I just stop and read. And that's just, like, the best education. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in, like, trying to accomplish a similar goal. But I also think that by reading a lot of good books, you just realize how many different ways there are to do something successfully. And that's, in and of itself, like, a really useful revelation or re-revelation. Just like, okay, there's not a rule for it. You just have to have a confident voice and just, like, own it throughout.
At what point do you all eventually show these pages to readers? Do you have, like, one special reader that you will show it to? And at what point in the process? Dalia, I know that you gave it to your agent, and your agent sort of gave you, like, extensive notes. How many people had taken a look at it before that point?
A lot. I have a really great community of writer friends, and thankfully it's growing. So I do have fresh readers, despite the fact that it's taken me ages to finish this book. But my husband, who's here, has read 1 million drafts. But I also have a few friends, 2 or 3 good friends that have read multiple drafts, and they can kind of tell where it's shifted and where I need to go. But I try to have a new reader for every draft. I think that's important. I mean, when I went out for an agent, I thought it was done. So I wasn't looking for an editor. But she's pushed me a lot, and she's really discerning, and she's a tougher reader than I am, which I think is actually a good thing to have. I haven't always felt that way, but it's pushed me in ways that I hadn't expected.
Well, when you give a work to people to read, there's always the risk, right, that if they give you feedback that is drastic, they're suggesting some drastic things. There's the question of, do you take it? You know, is it sort of like aligned with your sense of the book or not? How much you take, how much do you sort of like ignore? Do you feel like you have to have a strong sense of the book in your head before you give it to people, or do you sometimes give people, like, stuff to read when it's in a generative phase and you're just trying to, like, get new ideas or see if ideas are even on, like, a right track?
I usually wait until it's pretty done. I mean, sometimes I don't really get a chance to give it to anyone if I'm on deadline and it has to go in, you know, that just no one else gets to see it. But sometimes I'll give people, like, the first 3 chapters, like, before I send it to my agent, just to kind of see, you know, does this get you, you know, what do you think of just, like, the very beginning? And I find that very helpful. Also, sometimes people don't have time to read the whole thing, especially if I'm like, okay, I need to turn this in a week. Can you read it in a week? You know, that's not very nice to do to people. So I try to give small chunks.
Yeah, on Monsterland at one point, I definitely felt like I got sent in a couple different directions between people were being helpful, but I got sets of notes on a professional level, like my local readers, everything but at one point, and I started to listen maybe too much and not enough here and there, but I know at one point they were like, well, this kid's in Monsterland, he doesn't have any little buddies, kind of thing. And I was, well, it's kind of a solo journey. He's really searching. I didn't want it to be like him in the Goonies, running around out there. But it really threw me for a little while where I was suddenly like, oh no, like kids won't like it because there's no children, in this little section. But it worked itself out. I ended up adding one kid that I really like how he turned out. So something good came of it, but it definitely for a little while, I was lost.
I'm trying to get better about sharing my work more. And in fact, I've got almost my entire writers critique group here. We're a group of biographers, and we started out not as a critique group, but we've become one, and they've all been really super helpful on my next what I hope will be my next project in just helping me, with the query letter even, and with the proposal. But my husband, on my first two books, he was an editor, business editor, but still a senior editor before he went freelance. And he's also a good reader because he reads a lot. He's such a fast reader, and he reads so much more than me. And he reads a lot of fiction, which I think it's important, to read for pace and all of that. Nonfiction too, but I know he has a certain appreciation, and so I would give him chapters. With the Scarin book, I was really struggling with the end, and in fact, I got advice too. When you go through academic press, primarily like UT Press, the deal is your work gets sent out to two people, usually anonymous or more, in the field who review it. Should the publisher go forward with it? What are your suggestions? And they check off these boxes. It's all kind of daunting. It's accept with edits, keep as is. That's not what it says, but that's basically a thing. Or, accept but, or, there's all these things. And so then you get it back, and there was someone who it had gone out to, and I knew this person. I think he's a tremendous writer. But he had a pretty big suggestion, I think you should really just ditch this and focus on this. And it was kind of a crisis point for me for a good month. Oh God, do I do that? He's got so many more books than me. Oh, his books are great. Maybe I should. And ultimately, I just had to say, no, I need to keep this stuff in there because, it's characterization, it's this and that. And, sometimes I wonder about it, did it go? And I think you just have to finally go with your gut. Maybe if I did have an agent, that's where that person could weigh in. But I think you just really have to think about it and think about how you want to present that material to the reader and go with that.
I want to actually open it up to questions from the audience. We'll take a few questions. Normally we have a mic and somebody runs around, but that mic is out of service at the moment. So what I'm going to do is raise your hand, I'll point at you, and then I'll just repeat your question, for everybody to hear.
I have a question for whoever wants to enter. So kind of with the recent events that have gone on in the past, I guess, few days, but a few minutes ago, he said, you have to write with, whatever is going on, I guess, in the past few days or whatever, whether it's political or whatever. But with the hashtag #MeToo events, how do you write with that?
How do you write with the hashtag #MeToo stuff that's going on right now, and just the contentious politics that gets us so wound up?
How do you escape that and write it? I think that you just try to, I think that's where your work can be helpful, and you can descend into it, and you can use that as a way out. My parents are very ill. Sorry. Now you got me started. Thank you. And I was starting my proposal for my next book, and that was such a gift because I could just dive into this other world, and it's real, and it's about PTSD, so it's no party, let me tell you, but it's Right, but it's a way to use that as a release, maybe. And I think you find those releases to get through.
It's good for other people to hear about it.
Yeah, yeah. I think so.
And you know, how do you all handle this? Because it's like there's lots of things that happen in our lives that sort of knock us for a loop, right? And then you're also working on something. Like, how do you maintain a project in the midst of like all the stuff that happens to us?
I think there's a lot of self-care that needs to happen. I mean, I'm not going to lie to you guys. I spent the day on the couch binge watching Scandal because I was just not feeling it today, you know, like, and there are days like that. And I think that's totally okay. And there are going to be days where the work makes you feel really good and like you're, you know, contributing positively and like it's helping you. And there are days when it's not, and you just have to kind of be cool with that and just, you know, and anyone else?
Well, and just use that emotion. I mean, really, Monsterland's a lot about death and dealing with the lost one sort of thing. And we were dealing with some of that in my family also. So it was just one of those things of yeah, taking that and trying to make something, like you said, that's cathartic for other people. Like, hey, we're all going through this at some point. So let's just try to remember that. You know, it's a shared experience. Everybody's got ups and downs and burdens and all that. So, I mean, obviously we probably do this because we feel like we have a story to tell that's some kind of emotional tap in somewhere, right? I mean, I would think. Although my new book has a dancing hamster in it, so I'm not sure what that's tapping into exactly.
We all need a dancing hamster right now. That's perfect.
So one final question for y'all. What are you working on now, or what can we anticipate seeing from you in the next whatever?
Same book. But actually, my agent did force me to step back for a minute, and not force me. I was eager to outline the next book, and so I feel like I have that in my pocket for when I am done. So it's another historical fiction, but it goes a little bit further back, also Egypt.
That's cool.
That's really cool. Yeah, this took a while, and there was a lot of things going on, so I just started writing something else at the same time. And it was a lot of notes and fun, and there's a dancing hamster, so it was a very different, it's not very heavy. So I'm finishing that up, probably going to turn it in tomorrow, actually, for draft, and then we'll be pitching outlines of a second Monsterland and a draft of another book that I have in the next couple of weeks at Penguin. We'll see, but yeah, it's a really slow process, I'll warn you. One of my brothers has a book, and he was really excited and everything, and I'm like, yeah, cool, and he's about to send it out, and I was like, man, I hope you have a lot of patience. It's just, it's really trying, because you're so excited, right? You're like, everyone's going to love this, and it's like months go by. You're
In
like,
4 years, they will love it, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm working on I like to think of it as a biography of a 1946 Hollywood blockbuster called Best Years of Our Lives that changed the national conversation about PTSD and how it can inform today's situation. And I'm querying agents, so yeah, that's where I am right now.
My ghosts and I are going to try to get down to business on this middle grade book and see if we can finish this thing up, so yeah.
Please give our panelists a warm applause.
Thank you for listening. This has been the Writers League of Texas Third Thursday podcast. For more information about this program or the Writers League of Texas, please visit our website at writersleague.org, email us at wlt@writersleague.org, or give us a call at 512-499-8914.